This is our final part of Chapter 1. It is the second half of our overview of the research model. We went over the first four steps of the research model in Part 3, and now in Part 4, we will discuss the final four steps. So, beginning with Step 5, where you choose a research method. One of the first considerations that you would want to make as you select your research design is whether or not you want to engage in qualitative or quantitative research. This is not the same thing as quantitative variables, so do not get confused. Quantitative research is data that can be quantified. Oftentimes, this involves survey data, particularly large scale surveys that have large sample sizes. And that's because since the data can be quantified, you analyze it using computer programs like SPSS, Stata, or SAS. And it is easier to collect and easier to analyze than qualitative data is, which allows you to have much larger samples than you can in qualitative data. Of course, the trade-off is because survey data, this type of survey data relies on close-ended questions, which we will go over a little bit more in the upcoming slides. The trade-off is you do not necessarily get very detailed data because you are giving people forced choice options, A, B, C, D, yes, no. So it offers insight into patterns of social behavior and social attitudes, but it doesn't tell you why people do necessarily do the things they do or why they feel the way that they feel. So, example is if you want to answer the question, the percentage of U.S. parents who use corporal punishment, i.e., spanking, this is the type of question that could be easily answered through quantitative research methodology. Qualitative research, however, collects data that cannot be quantified or easily quantified. Therefore, the data that it collects is oftentimes much more in depth knowledge of social life, institutions, and processes. So you are now getting to those why type questions, how people feel, because you are collecting this data in such a way that oftentimes it is open ended and more interpretive. Because of this, it is harder and more time consuming to collect as well as to analyze. So you have much smaller sample sizes. This type of data can take the form of a focus group, participant, non participant observation, interview, or archival research designs. So, an example of the type of question that you probably would want to use a qualitative research design to answer is if you wanted to answer the question why parents in a particular demographic group, whether it's based on race or socioeconomic status, are more or less likely to use spanking as a disciplinary method. The fact that this is a why question just kind of suggests that it probably would be better asked or better assessed through more open-ended qualitative research as opposed to quantitative research methodology. And so once you kind of get a sense of, do you want to go the quantitative methodology route where you may have larger samples but less detailed data, or do you want to do the qualitative methodology route where you have smaller samples but more detailed data, then you can further narrow down your research method by choosing a specific research design. So there are seven major types of research designs that can be used in sociology, and we'll be talking about all seven in this presentation. The first is survey research, of which there can be multiple forms, questionnaires, interviews, or focus groups. Field work, which also is called participant observation. Case studies, experimentation, secondary analysis, Content analysis, which also sometimes is referred to as analysis of documents, and unobtrusive measures, which is also sometimes referred to as non participant observation. So we will be discussing all seven of these. But before we get into that, let's talk about a term that you've already heard me use, sample sizes and sampling. Because once you have a sense of the research design that you're going to use, part of your research method plan is figuring out who your sample is going to be. And that's because while your question refers to a population, the entire group of people that you are interested in who are relevant to your study, because in almost all cases, it is not possible to actually include an entire population in your research. It is necessary to have a sample. And so a sample is a relatively small number of people who are chosen to represent a population. Usually, the larger the sample, the better. Although, even if the population you are referring to is like the United States adult population, once you have a sample size of over 1,000, as long as it is a well formulated sample, you certainly can get away with using your results of 1,000 person sample to make some conclusions about the larger population. Now, what does that mean to say that you have a well formulated sample? Well, obviously, you want your sample to be generalizable to the larger population. So, you want to make sure that people are represented, different types of people are represented, which is why it brings us to two specific forms of sampling. One form, random sampling, some people consider this to be ideal because everyone in the population of interest has an equal chance of being chosen for the sample for the study. And because you aren't allowing people to opt in, or because you're not necessarily using what we call convenient sampling, where you just ask your questions or you include people who just happen to be the most convenient, random sampling does increase the likelihood that different types of people will be represented in your sample, but it also increases the likelihood that your sample will not be biased on the basis of things like, if you only ask people or if you only ask people that, were conveniently located in certain areas, and therefore you overlooked parts of the population, or, if you allow people to opt in, that people most motivated to participate will give kind of a false sense of like the general level of motivation or interest in your topic that exist in the larger population. So oftentimes, we are proponents of random sampling. But the thing about random sampling is if you have a sizable minority in your population, there is the chance that if you just took a random sample, you would not get enough of those people in your sample. So, think about something like the United States population, where we know about 1% of our population identifies as Native American. If we did a random sample where, we took every 1,000th and social security number, it's a very good possibility that enough Native Americans would not be the 1,000th person, and that they would be largely absent from our sample. And so this brings up the concept of stratified random sampling, where you take your sample, you take your population, and you divide it into a series of subgroups based on qualities like age or race or socioeconomic status or religious affiliation. And then once you have divided it into those subgroups, then you randomly sample. And so in this way, you have a much more even representation of different subgroups in your sample population, which is key. Because, if you have a bad sample, it can allow you to come to bad conclusions. It can lead you to conclude things are true or not true, based on your sample's answers, replies. And in this way, it could lead to issues with both validity, a term that we'll go over later in this video, but also if your sample is not very representative of the population as a whole, it also raises questions about the generalizability of your sample as well, right? If it doesn't really represent the population as a whole, then the answers that you come to might be true for some people, some demographics, but perhaps maybe would not be very generalizable to other groups in the population. And this is what we, of course, are trying to avoid. And so, almost all the research designs are going to involve using a sample as opposed to a population. There are very few studies, as I already indicated, that are based on populations, just because of the cost and time that go in doing a population based project. For instance, the United States attempts to do a population based survey every 10 years, and that is, of course, the census, and we have one coming up this year. And the fact, and it is both a costly and time consuming endeavor that the U.S. engages in, and probably part of the reason why we don't do it more often than 10 years is because of that. So you have your sample. You have come up with some way to access a group of people that you feel like are representative to the population that your question is relevant to, and your population can vary, of course, based on your question. So then, now getting specifically into those designs, beginning with the first survey research. So a survey uses a survey tool with a group of people in order to determine characteristics, opinions, and behaviors. And oftentimes it relies on self-reported data, so we're having to take people at their word. And so one way we can kind of distinguish between different surveys types is whether or not it's a questionnaire or interview. Questionnaires involve your respondent having access to the survey instrument itself. They are working through the instrument. There is not necessarily another person present asking them the questions. If another person is present and is asking the respondent the question, so that the respondent doesn't actually have access to the instrument itself, it's not in their hands, it's not something that they can really read and interact with on their own, then we call this an interview. And so whether or not it is a questionnaire or interview, the format also can differ. So, interviews in particular can take place via telephone or in person. And questionnaires, of course, can be in person questionnaires where a person has like a physical hard copy of the instrument, or they are accessing a copy of the instrument on a laptop given to them by the researcher, or we can send questionnaires via email to people. Focus groups are a form of survey research that are a little different. They involve a interview setup, so there is a person there that is asking the questions, but instead of just asking it to one person, they are asking it to a group of people. Most of the time, focus groups are used when the data that you are collecting is not seen as being very confidential or very personal or sensitive type data. Focus groups are very popular when it comes to things like marketing or or responding to new TV shows or movies. This type of survey research is really popular in those fields. Whether you are doing a questionnaire or interview, regardless of the format you're using, surveys involve questions, and there are two types of questions that they involve. One is a closed-ended question. Closed-ended questions result in quantitative data, even if the question itself is a qualitative question. Like, for instance, this one you see, which of the following best fits your idea of what should be done to someone who has been convicted of spouse abuse? 1 probation, 2 jail time, 3 community service, 4 counseling, 5 divorce, 6 nothing is a family matter. That is a qualitative variable. But because it is giving you these kind of forced choice answers, we can turn this into quantitative data, right? We can do actual statistical operations with this question, and we can do that with all close-ended questions. So a lot of questionnaires in particular, although as well as some interviews, are close ended in nature, which allows us to have larger samples, because we are going to be relying on computer statistical software in order to analyze this types of data. Open-ended questions result in qualitative data because the answers that you receive cannot be easily quantifiable. So the open-ended question here would be, what do you think should be done to someone who has been convicted of spousal abuse? Although you can put open-ended questions on questionnaires, you got to think, how likely is someone to write out a very long, thoughtful response to an open-ended question, especially if you put multiple of them on a questionnaire. So open-ended questions are usually not as common on questionnaires. They are more common in interviews, and they are more likely to be used in focus groups, where you kind of have a person there who is collecting that data, usually by recording the interview, as well as taking some handheld notes. But then that data itself is qualitative data, and we consider open ended interviews to be qualitative research, while we consider questionnaires and usually their reliance on close-ended questions to be quantitative research. Asking good questions is key, and there is a whole science to this, and I don't expect you to know all this information, but you want to make sure that your questions are neutrally worded, that they're not leading, that they're not confusing, that you aren't asking multiple questions in one question, and that's just because, similar to the importance of having a good sample, if you ask bad questions, this can lead to unclear or bad data that can encourage people to come to the wrong conclusions and make the wrong conclusions in regards to the question that they are asking. So now we come to research design number two, as well as a discussion of non-obtrusive measures, and that's field work. And for field work, this is always qualitative data, because field work is when you do in-depth, extended study to describe or analyze a group or community. And you do this by going out into the field. You go out into the real world that you don't manipulate at all, and then you engage in some type of observation. You can engage in what we call participant observation, which is you participate in the field site, and at the same time you are kind of writing down notes, gathering data about what's going on. Or you can do what we call a detached observation, where you are watching what's happening at the field site, but you are not inserting yourself into the activity. And we also call this non-participant observation. So the difference of this would be, if you wanted to learn about the dynamics that occur in a college classroom, if you were to answer this question through participant observation, you might enroll in a selection of college classes and go to those classes and participate as a student, but then at the same time take notes about what's going on in terms of dynamics. If you wanted to approach this in a detached observation or non-participant observation way, then you, instead of enrolling as a student, would seek permission from professors to be in their classrooms as a silent, detached observer, where you are just kind of taking notes on what you hear and see and witness in their classrooms. And there are arguments to be made about, both participant observation and detached observation having its strengths and weaknesses. Non obtrusive measures is a form of non participant observation, but it's a little different. Non obtrusive measures normally involves you going into a field site and collecting data in such a way that really even the people in the field site are not necessarily aware of your presence or aware that you are doing this. Perhaps a good example of a non obtrusive measure data collection would be if you were interested in. Is there a difference between high income and low income neighborhoods and their willingness to promote politicians and political ideologies? And maybe you answer this question by getting in your car and going into different neighborhoods and just counting the number of political related signs and bumper stickers and flags you see, and writing down what types of political signage and bumper stickers and flags you're seeing in these different types of neighborhoods. And so in this case, probably nobody necessarily in the neighborhood would even necessarily be aware that you are in their neighborhood collecting this information. And you certainly aren't inserting yourself into the dynamic the way a participant observer would. And so, in this case, for field work, as well as for non obtrusive measures, the notes that you collect are your data. And in most of these cases, these notes are more likely to be qualitative than quantitative. Which now brings us to working with existing data. So, what happens when you work with data that you aren't collecting yourself? And there are two different forms of this: secondary data analysis and content analysis. So, it's worth noting that secondary data analysis is the most commonly used methodology in sociology. So, what involves is there is often data that is collected by the government and universities as far as part of large scale survey research. So they ask hundreds of questions to people and they collect this data, and then they make it publicly available to other researchers, or they make it semi publicly available, like you have to ask them for permission to use it. But they do make it available to other people to ask their own questions using the variables, using the questions that were on the instrument, that people can ask a variety of their own research questions based on the questions that the original researchers asked and the data that they collected. Um, so, because uh, of the fact that this oftentimes does involve these large scale surveys, this is almost always quantitative survey data that you are using when you are engaging in secondary data analysis. It is the fastest form and most efficient form of data analysis to engage in, which is part of why it is so popular. It is also the least costly because you're not having to actually go out and collect the data yourself and compensate the respondents yourself. So, this form of research design is very popular with graduate students as well as with early career academics. Content analysis is similar in the sense that you're not collecting your own data, but it's a little different because you are now doing a document analysis of written materials or cultural products that were created for some other purpose besides your research. And so this could be newspaper articles, court records, films, it could be reports, it could be images. You could do content analysis of documented communication like tweets or laws or, Instagram profiles, Tinder profiles. So in this case, once again, you are going to be looking at things that you did not create yourself. So it is similar to the secondary data analysis. It's a little bit more cost effective and a little bit more efficient than kind of collecting your own data from respondents. And then oftentimes, because you are doing this analysis of these products, most of the time this is more of a qualitative analysis, although there are certainly, quantitative analysis that can be done. Like if you're looking for the number of times certain words are used in Tinder profiles. If you wanted to see, like, hey, is there a difference in the top 10 descriptors used in male and female Tinder profiles, right? That would be more of a quantitative analysis, a quantitative content analysis there. Um, Not all research questions are appropriate for content analysis, but certainly if you are asking questions about the kind of structure, tone of human communications or human cultural products, so things like song lyrics or TV shows or movies, then perhaps it is appropriate to consider content analysis as a form of research design. And then we come to experimentation. Experiments are research techniques for investigating cause and effect under control conditions. You have experimental group. Those are the subjects that are exposed to the stimuli. This is the independent variable. What you are arguing is the cause. And then you have a control group who are not exposed to the stimuli. And then you measure the difference between the groups, and that kind of tells you, or that kind of lets your dependent variable, the effect. Because there is this level of artificiality in experimentation, right? You're kind of creating this fake setting. Experiments are not nearly as popular in sociology as they are in psychology. We are certainly sometimes very interested in some of these psychological experiments and what they tell us about human nature and cognitive processes, but sociologists themselves are oftentimes much less likely to use the experiment research design than they are other designs that are based more on real world settings and kind of real world behaviors. But that being said, despite their small sample sizes and the fact that usually those samples are non representative, and as I've already indicated, those artificial contrived conditions, experiments can be very informative and significant. And there are experiments that, even though they aren't conducted by sociologists, they are frequently referenced in sociology literature. And I give you a collection of links if you want to check those out. That is totally optional. There won't be any questions on your test about those, but you are certainly encouraged to kind of consider the Robbers Cave, the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Stereotype Threat Experiment. There will be other experiments that we talk about throughout the course when we get to those specific chapters, and then we will also be talking about the sociology version of an experiment, which we call an audit study, and we'll be talking about that when we get to our chapter where we address discrimination. The final research design is probably the most rarely used in the discipline, and that is the case study. And that's where you do an in-depth study of one particular case. In the kind of expectation that that in-depth study of that case illuminates a phenomena, tells you more about a phenomena. We don't really use case studies in sociology often because of the lack of generalizability. So there's only a handful of cases where we really emphasize the utility of using the case study design. So then we come to step six, and that is where you are, actually out there collecting your data. And this is a good place to just kind of remind you that there are two primary goals of research. You want to collect data that is valid, and you want your data to be reliable. Validity is when you actually accurately measure what you think you're measuring. What your observations adequately reflect the real world. They get at the capital T truth. And reliability is the extent to which the findings are consistent with different studies of the same phenomena, or if you repeat your study over time. Because if you are getting at the capital T truth, then ideally it should be reliable. And so I think the best way to kind of memorize this is to think about this in terms of bullseye. The goal is to get all the arrows right there in the center. You want it to be reliable and you want it to be valid. Now, if every time you do your study, you hit a different place on the board, you know that it's both not reliable, but because it's not reliable, it's also not valid because you have no way of knowing which one of these is the capital T truth if every single time you do your study, you come up with a different answer. Now, what is scarier is that it is possible that something can be reliable and not valid. And the reason why this is the scarier option is because this can mislead researchers into thinking that they are, in fact, accurately measuring a phenomena when they're not. And sometimes this whole is reliable but not valid can be indicative of, perhaps not asking the best questions, not setting your design up in the best possible way. Or in a lot of cases, this can be particularly true if you systematically overlook and don't include specific subgroups into your sample. So step 7, you have now collected your data. It's now time to analyze the results. In this class, we don't talk a lot about data analysis because if you go on to be a sociology major at a four-year university, you will have whole classes about this. You will learn about all of the ideas and concepts that underlie data analysis and increasingly the number of computer software programs that will assist you in doing this. For this class, the only thing that I'm going to emphasize is that there is rarely only one interpretation of the data, and sometimes there is not even a clear right interpretation. But that doesn't mean that interpretation is the same thing as opinion. And that's because although there might be multiple interpretations of the data, you still just can't ignore it. And what I always encourage students when they are reading research articles, that they want to approach them with maybe what I call mindful skepticism. Ask good questions like, how old is this data? What type of sample did they use? Was it a representative, generalizable sample? Were the questions good questions? Were they misleading? Should they have supplemented, their design with other forms of data? But that's not the same thing as being stubbornly resistant. Sometimes social science research has been very useful in proving that things are occurring in society that people are not willing to accept. Sometimes social science research has shown a light on, how people feel or how people behave when other people aren't looking, and that's really key and critical when discussing social phenomena. And social science research has been used to prove that some of the things that we feel like we know to be true about society because it's based on our common sense understanding of the world or it's based on our personal experience is in fact false. And all I ask for students to be is to not be stubbornly resistant. The fact of the matter is if you believe something is true, but we have very established, detailed, reliable, valid studies that suggest it's not, instead of clinging to your perception of what you think is true, instead consider why you are so resistant in letting go of your opinion, especially if you yourself, which I'm sure is true of most of us, has not engaged in any type of systematic research as a basis of that opinion. Instead, you hold that opinion because of one of those other ways of knowing things. I think this can always be the challenge of sociology. And the final step of the research model is you share your results. And what sociologists do with their findings kind of differs based on whether or not they are, engaging in basic sociology, applied sociology, and public sociology. So this goes back to what I was discussing in the earlier part of this chapter when I was stating that there is this contradiction where there are some sociologists that believe sociology should be an analysis only discipline, and there are some sociologists who are very much committed to the idea that we are an analysis and reform discipline. For sociologists that are just pro analysis only, this is basic sociology, and you share your results in things like academic journals and at academic conferences and in textbooks with students that are studying your discipline. If you are an analysis and reform sociologist, then you apply your sociology, right? You actively use it to create and construct policies in government, in schools, in the judicial system. You in HR policies, right? You actively apply it in whatever the relevant sectors are of society. And then there is that meeting in the middle where you yourself don't work to apply it in society, but you make your results readily available to those who do. And this means that instead of just sharing your results in academic journals, you write them up in newspapers, you tweet about them, you go onto programs to reach a broader, more general audience. And so that brings us to the end of our discussion of research design, as well as our end to the end of our discussion of chapter 1.